Well, thanks for having me. How many people have taken any sort of look at ASP.NET 5? No one? That's good.
Yeah,
a little bit.
Eric actually did a small talk on ASP.NET 5 a couple of months ago.
Yeah, it's what, like November?
Mm-hmm.
So it's changed quite a bit since then.
Yeah, so obviously it hasn't been out very long, so it's something I'm still playing with, but the way I see it, there's three major things to look at. There's a brand new project system, and this is either going to make people very happy or make some people are going to be sad because this new project system is entirely a file-based project system, so you no longer have to store the name of all the files that are in a project in your CS.proj file. The project system simply looks at your file system, and whatever is there is in your project. It doesn't matter if it's a JavaScript file or if it's a C# file, because this new project system is going to compile everything dynamically. Basically, anything that is under, by default, a directory named source, src, is something, if it's a .cs file, it can be compiled and put into an assembly on the fly. And you can always pre-compile things for production, but when you're developing, everything's really happening dynamically in memory. If you go in and look in the bin directory, we're accustomed to seeing all the assemblies for our project there. They're not going to be there with ASP.NET 5. Everything's built with Roslyn, which is the new C# compiler as a service, and all the assemblies are just kept in memory and cached, and it theoretically should be a lot faster than what we had in the past. Working with some of the betas, it wasn't quite as fast as I had hoped it would be, but you know how Microsoft always saves some of the performance optimizations till the end. And there's a new default folder structure, so no longer will ASP.NET just serve up anything in the root of your project. Instead, we're following a standard that's a little more like what the rest of the world does, at least the Node.js and the Ruby world and the Python world. You'll have a directory. By default, it's that www root directory that you see in the project screenshot there on the left. And that's the only directory where you can put static files that would be served up. So if you're writing something like a web API, you can put a web API controller wherever you want in the project. It gets compiled into an assembly and it can respond to requests. But if you have CSS files, JavaScript files, images, HTML files, they're all going to go into the www root folder. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a brand new configuration system that we can look at too. And we're trying to get away from, or we are getting away from having a machine level web config and a web config in the project and having a web config that says, no, don't serve things from this directory. Instead, we have a much, much simpler configuration system. So one big thing to look at is the new project system. Another new thing to look at is that there's now multiple versions of the CLR that we can build against. We're still going to be running against or we can still compile and execute against the full CLR that gets installed on a machine where all the assemblies live in a GAC, or at least the Microsoft assemblies live in a global assembly cache. But Microsoft is also coming up with what they call the cloud-optimized core CLR. The idea was that this will give you assemblies that are very easy to Xcopy. So you can, literally the CLR can be delivered as a NuGet package, which is just a zip file. So you unzip that NuGet package and there's your CLR. That's what you can run against. That means it's very easy to deploy applications to a server where every application can use a different version of the CLR because they'll each just be using their own NuGet package for that particular version that they need. And Microsoft also plans on making this core CLR work across different platforms. So you can run it on OS X, you can run it on Linux. I don't think this is actually going to be a big deal at the start because the core CLR right now, it's basically rebuilding this from scratch. So it doesn't have everything in it that you would probably use in your application today. So you either need to cut back some of your features or find alternatives for them before you can switch to the core CLR. But I would expect this to grow moving forward, so it will add features that we're accustomed to. So, for example, the ability to use the SMTP class in .NET isn't there in the core CLR. So how do you send email? I don't know if that's something that will ever be in the core CLR. I'm not sure. I think the thought is that if you're building something these days, you might be using some third party's RESTful web service to send emails, so maybe that will never make it into the core CLR. We'll see. But they're redesigning that to have garbage collectors and things like that that are just efficient for server-side work. And it's all wrapped up in a NuGet package, and it runs outside of Windows. So this can be interesting. And then there's the unification. So there is an ASP.NET MVC6 that is part of ASP.NET 5, and that includes now the Web API. So we've gone through this process the last few years where, unfortunately, just because of the way things were developed at Microsoft, there was one team that built ASP.NET MVC, and there was a different team that came more from the WCF side of the house that built Web API. And for the last couple of years, we've had two sets of model binders, two different types of base controller classes, two different routing rules. All those things go away because with ASP.NET MVC6, you can write a traditional MVC controller, or you can write a Web API controller. They both can derive from the same base class. They're both using the same model binders and serializers and formatters and configuration. So there's fewer things for us to learn to use this technology. And obviously it makes life easier for Microsoft because now when they come up with a new feature, they don't have to try to put it into both frameworks and figure out how things work together. So less overhead, less duplication, and the big thing is Web API was always designed to not use the system.webassembly. It was always designed to be self-hosted, had the ability to run outside of IAS. You could run it from a console application or a Windows service. And ASP.NET MVC also now has that ability. So when you're building a web application with ASP.NET 5, there is no system.web. All of that is going away. And again, that's a place where some people might be a little bit sad. There's going to be some work in migrating existing applications if you want to use this new project style and this new core CLR and all this stuff. There's some work you'll have to do. And also, there's no real new web forms. So if anyone is in love with ASP.NET web forms or even Visual Basic, those things just aren't around in these new project templates.
Hey Scott?
Yeah.
If they're being combined, how would things like using the authorized attribute be handled, using MVC versus the Web API? I guess one would be token-based.
Right. Well, so the authorized attribute is actually an interesting one because it will work just fine either way. Basically, what authorized does is it goes and it checks the current user property just to see if the user is authenticated at the very least, unless you've specified a specific role. And it's actually different components that populate that user property. So you can install a component that will rely on cookie-based authentication. And if the user sends up a cookie with their browser to either type of controller, then that will set the user property, the authorized attribute will see it, and things will go normally. So you can install different components that look for access tokens. So it can work either way.
Is that done through OWIN middleware?
Yeah, exactly. OWIN middleware takes an even bigger role these days. So let's actually try to over to Visual Studio here. Oh, I have to exit out of here and flip. Let's create a new project. So I'm running a pre-release of Visual Studio on a Windows 10 technical preview. So anything could go wrong. It's been good for the last 2 days anyway. Yeah, I want to create a new ASP.NET web application. We'll just call it web application 1 is fine. And so starting here, first of all, there is still ASP.NET 4.6 template. So if you need to work with an application that you've been building in Visual Studio 2013, that still works in Visual Studio 2015. If you want to create an application just like the application you created with Visual Studio 2013, these templates along the top row will do that. So these are the same templates that we're accustomed to where MVC and Web API aren't combined, and they still use system.web, and they still use the full .NET framework. So what I want to look at is the preview project for ASP.NET 5. We'll start with the empty one. I can also show you what the starter web one looks like in just a bit. And since I can't see you guys now, just feel free to yell anytime you have a question.
Oh, you can't do this? There should be
and hopefully this won't take too long to create. It truly is an empty project. It won't have any content in it.
Oh,
there is, but when I flip over into my Windows VM, I don't see it. So, yeah. All right. Let's crank up the font a little bit first. I thought I had changed that already. Take a look at Solution Explorer. And let's take a look at Startup first. So this is pretty much a completely empty web application. I just want to show you that there is no web.config, there is no global.asax. Essentially, this is an entirely new world for ASP.NET. They really, what Microsoft has said, what the ASP.NET team has said is that we want to take all of our collective knowledge from building ASP.NET from the last 15 years, add into it everything that we've learned from other environments like Node.js and Ruby, and just build this thing from the ground up. And as part of that, one of the things they wanted to do was simplify the configuration system. And obviously, they're very focused on Azure these days, and working with a technology like Azure Web Sites is very different from everything we've done in the past where we deploy to, we know we're deploying to some specific machine, and we know if we go into the C:\Windows.NET framework directory somewhere, we'll find configuration files that exist for that machine. And those kind of things just go away when you're building cloud applications. So, why have things like web.config anymore? We're just going to get rid of configuration files. So, first thing I'll show you here then is there is still logic for application startup. It's just not in a global.asax anymore. What it is in a startup.cs class. Now, we have had a startup CS class in previous versions of ASP.NET. It's where we can configure our own middleware. And with ASP.NET 5, that is everything for startup logic. Everything goes into the startup class. Everything that you do is configured through middleware. If you want to use ASP.NET MVC, you have to reference that assembly, and then you also have to configure it in with middleware here with startup class. So I'll show you that in just a second. There's a project.json, which is about the closest thing that you'll have to a configuration file at the start. But this, just to be clear, this is not a runtime configuration at all. This is really your project configuration. For example, where do I serve static files from? By default, that's this www.root folder. What dependencies do I have? So I have a dependency on, this is a NuGet package that will allow this to be hosted inside of IAS. What frameworks will I compile against? These two lines of code say that for this project, every time I do a build, I want you to compile against both the full .NET framework as well as the core CLR. And essentially, if you write a piece of code for a class that doesn't exist in the core CLR, you will get an error that that class is not available for that compilation setting. And if the core CLR is something that you don't want to support, you can just take that line out of there then you'll only be building against the full framework. And then there's some other stuff for packaging up this application that we don't have to worry about just yet. Let's just go to www root folder and add an HTML file. So the code name for this project for ASP.NET 5 was Project K. It has since been renamed to DNX, but you'll still see Project K in a few places. Create index.html. Can I view this in a browser? Should be able to, even though I didn't put any text inside of there. I also don't get an error, so that works. But I could also, oops, wrong terminal. I need to get to my Windows Start menu. There we go. I think we call this Web Application 1. We're in the source folder, www.root. Let's create a second page. So this is just HTML, and I can show you, wow, hotkeys are not working. I can show you how we can do the same thing with compilers later. So I just created that file on the file system. You can see it already showed up over here inside of www.root. Actually, this is a feature I'm really excited about because CS proj files were always a source of merge conflicts, if nothing else, in source control, because of everyone that's adding files to a project and checking things in. So that all of that kind of goes away, which is kind of nice. Oh, the other thing I want to... Oh,
there's no way to exclude a project or exclude an item from the project?
Well, what you can do is you can exclude certain folders from being bundled up and packaged as part of your web application. But I think as far as exclude from project, I don't think we can do that now from this view. I think if it's in the file system, it's going to show up here.
Okay.
I think so, yeah. And by the way, what's global.json? Global.json is just a way of saying, of telling Visual Studio that and ASP.NET 5, the places you're going to look for source code to compile is in the source folder and the test folder. So you can have as many folders there as you want. And that just means if this web application wasn't under one of those two folders that was listed there, things wouldn't compile and magic wouldn't happen. That's basically what that is saying. So let's add, let me see if I can do this. Let's try to add some ASP.NET MVC capability to this project so I can show you what that would look like. So to do that, or one way to do that is to add the dependency on that particular NuGet package. So there is still a UI where you can right-click here and say I want to add a package reference, but there's also IntelliSense in this JSON file. So that if I want ASP.NET MVC, I should just be able to type MVC. There it found Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC, and then I get to select the version that I want. And actually, before I select that, before I save this file, let me expand this references just so you can see that we're managing references for two different target frameworks, the full CLR and the core CLR. So once I select MVC and a version and save this file, you'll notice it says restoring because it's detected that we've added a new NuGet package. Hopefully it's going to be able to download that, which it did. And so my references are updated. And really this is everything I have a reference for. And you know, you get some things like MS Corelib for free. You don't have to specify that. But ASP.NET MVC, that particular package depends on the Razor NuGet package, caching package, and those just get pulled in by default since they're dependencies.
Hey,
oh yeah.
And the the core dependencies, you had a dependency of IIS.
Yes.
I thought the core is independent of any web.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm trying to think about the best way to answer this. What you can do is you can specify at this level other web servers. So if I specify, actually I haven't tried this in this with this latest release that I just installed. There's a server out there they call Kestrel, which runs on Linux and OS X. And if I specify that as a dependency, that's technically a web server that would work with both frameworks. And I'm pretty sure they still want the core CLR to be able to work with IIS, but yeah, it's not dependent on IIS. It doesn't have to be on IIS. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, and if you get into a place where you want to have, say, with the core framework, when you're building against it, you want to take a dependency just only when you're compiling against that particular framework, you can list dependencies here inside of frameworks, and they would go to one of those two respective places then.
Is that IIS package that you have then, does that take care of it running on top of Express?
It does, yeah. And essentially what will happen is this. Let's actually look at this web application with Explorer. And you'll notice I don't even get a bin directory, unfortunately. Previous builds I would get a bin directory. I apologize for that. I was gonna show you there's a bin directory, and that all the only thing that was in that bin directory, maybe they moved it under artifacts. No. Never mind. They have little shims that load that essentially boot one version of the CLR or the other one, and then figure out which web server they're supposed to run under. So is it going to be IIS, or is it just going to be a console application or a Windows service or something? Anyway, we have that reference. Let's go over to startup.cs. So what's interesting about this new framework, in the past, what we were able to do is just take a reference on ASP.NET MVC or install the web API NuGet packages, and we're pretty much off and running. Or at least with MVC, there wasn't a lot of additional work other than maybe configuring routes. In this new world, we have to configure ASP.NET MVC into our processing pipeline. So right now, when an HTTP request arrives, our application's not going to do anything with it. It's just going to pass it right along to whatever the underlying host is, like IIS, because we have literally not configured anything into our application. So I can come in here and I can say, let's do this actually. Let's do app.run, see if I can get this right. I'm going to write a little delegate here that I hope I will be able to say context.response.write async hello. And I think I might have to make this async, set the deal, and then maybe await this. Okay, let's try that. Let me save that file, and let's try to run this without the debugger. My shortcut keys aren't working properly tonight, so I'll use the menu. There we go. All right, so now I have installed a very simple piece of middleware that just takes every request, and it will return hello for every request that comes in. That's just to get you familiar with, what middleware is doing at a very low level. I can also configure this to use the ASP.NET MVC framework. And now basically what will happen is if the MVC framework processes the request, we'll have some controller execute, and it will return the response. But if it doesn't run, my little piece of middleware can still run and return hello to every request. Now, there's one other thing that is a little bit awkward until you get further along with ASP.NET 5, but in addition to configuring the middleware, we also have to configure services, because basically everything with ASP.NET 5 is now written with dependency injection baked in. And ASP.NET provides a very simple inversion of control container that can do things like inject services into controllers when a controller has a non-default constructor, so it needs something, you can have it injected. You can also plug in structure map and inject or any of those things, but basically to get MVC working, actually let me show you this. If I...
Yeah, is this Microsoft's way of kind of encouraging the use of dependency injection?
Yeah, I think so. I think they sort of recognized that a lot of people were building software that way, and it was coming out pretty good and pretty flexible. And there was always some pressure on teams like the MVC team and the Web API team to add dependency injection hooks or capabilities. So they've just gone full hog with it, just going crazy. Yeah, notice the error I get right now, unable to find the required services, it actually tells me what I need to do. I need to add the MVC service into my services collection. You can basically think of this as configuring your IOC container. So services.add, there should be a helper method for this, MVC, should take care of that. And we should get by that error now.
What exactly does adding MVC to your services do?
I'll be honest. Yeah, I would have to play with that a little bit longer, but my guess would be, without having looked at the source code recently, that sets up the IOC container with things like the model binders and the formatters and things like that will be needed. Yep.
Hey, Scott.
Yes.
With the services, is this registering services that can be used throughout the entire like Owen pipeline? So, like, for example, if I wanted to use a database context within like my authorization middleware, is that accessible from that services collection?
Yeah, these services are available everywhere. I would have to check a little bit more to make sure I answered that with 100% correct answer, like under what conditions and exactly where it's available in all your middleware. But you can, I can show you an example if we have enough time where I can create, you know, a data access class, configure it into my services collection by adding it as a singleton, which is probably not what you want to do, or adding it as a transient, which means it gets created for everything that needs an instance, or add it as scoped, which is probably what you've been using if you've been using DB context. That's kind of your unit of work approach where you get one instance per request.
Yeah, I mean, this has been really fun lately. Is you got to do this like weird setup dance to get a database context to be scoped for your entire request.
Right.
But still have it, you know, used during the authorization step, which is they're trying to move outside of just the MVC pipeline.
Oh, yeah. I know what you mean with the O and the middleware stuff. I'm actually going to have to investigate that scenario. I'm pretty sure that works, but yeah, like I say, I've just started playing with this myself.
Sure.
Yeah.
But then that add scope to the HTTP request coming in.
That's right. So we get one per request. So let's try this. The other thing I can do with MVC is add my default routing rules here. So that could be something like routes.map routes. Let's set up the common default route that has a URL template, right? Just like we're accustomed to: controller name, action name, possibly an ID. Let's just leave that off for right now. The other interesting thing that you can do here with MVC6 is instead of using that anonymously typed object, which was always sort of, I don't know, just a little bit obnoxious to specify default values, you can now actually specify those default values inside of the template. So I can say default controller is home, default index is action, default action is index, sorry.
Oh, okay.
And there's also still attribute-based routing, but, you know, the default route is something you probably would want for a lot of applications anyway. So now I should be able to add a new folder. Let's call it controllers. And actually, let's see if I can do this. If I come into controllers, let's create the home controller.cs. You'll notice it shows up inside of here. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. Microsoft, ASP.NET, MVC. I just want to show you the dynamic compilation feature. So this is a fancy way to do that. Chances are it's going to fail though, but let's try it. Controller. Now I'm writing JavaScript. And no IntelliSense. Let's just return hello from MVC. Let's see if that works. If I just save that file, refresh the browser. Yeah, we got it. Got to work. So there's no build step there. You just come into these files, you save them, and ASP.NET 5 just rebuilds things on the fly.
How do you get around the build stuff there? No?
What? Yeah, so essentially behind the scenes, ASP.NET is really just watching the file system for any changes that occur. And when you save a .cs file, it's going to start compilation immediately and rebuild assemblies that it's holding in memory and, you know, shove them into IIS Express when everything's successful.
Could you still have like post-build and pre-build steps?
You can. It's a little bit different. So now what you do is in your project.json file, you can specify a script section. And I believe for post-build, oh, yeah, they changed this a little bit.
Ready pack and pre-pack and.
Yeah, actually, that one I'd have to check on too. I'm pretty sure there was a post-build. There used to be a post-build in the previous release. But this is where you could, this is typically where you would specify things like that.
Is this just like an alias to a batch script or something?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're basically going to, you know, you could call foo here, but or I could say, you know, post publish execute foo. Foo would just have to be something that's in the path. So it's just gonna, it can be a PowerShell script or an executable or whatever. Actually, I can show you some proper examples of this if we open up a different project, which we can do here in just a bit. Any of this making any sense, though?
Sorry?
I said, am I making any sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I was just saying, like, it'd be nice now I don't have to have this, like, hidden PowerShell script somewhere in, like, a solution folder or something.
Great. I could go through and show you that I could still return a Razor view and I could still pass it a model, but to be honest, all of that stuff still works like you're used to. So if you've been using MVC or Web API, almost all the code that you'll write will be the same code that you used to write with this new system. Just maybe slightly different namespaces and slightly different class names, slightly different assemblies you'll be working with, but it all works the same. And let me show you this real quick. So the dependency injection part. You know, I hate, just to simplify things, I'm going to put something in the same file. So if we had a interface data source that will, get numbers, and then I implemented that data source as an iData source. And let me just try to use some sort of shortcut key tonight. Oh, the shortcuts want to work. There we go. Let's just return 1, 2, 3 or something ridiculous. So now I'm going to be able to use this in my controller. Typical approach is you'd have a constructor that just takes an iData source and probably save that off in a private field somewhere. Boy. All right, let's see what ASP.NET does now. Close the browser, so let's try it this way. Whoops, what did I miss?
There's a syntax error down where you put the number array in.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, you're right.
What's that?
We said you're writing some JavaScript there.
Yeah, I've written so much JavaScript recently that I don't know what I'm doing anymore. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Oh, man. I have to get back to C#. Yeah, so if you remember the old ASP.NET MVC, it would have just given up. It would have said, sorry, you have a non-default constructor. I don't know what to do. Now the error message is just, I'm unable to resolve this service. So at least ASP.NET MVC is going out and looking for that. And that's where you can come into startup.cs, and you could say something like services, let's add, for this one we could just add transient or something. When you see an iData source, here is what I want you to use. I want you to use, I have to give it a func, so a func that takes a service provider, and I didn't see that other parameter. We'll just call it X. Return a new data source. And let's see here. Oh, right. It's just service provider and return the data source. So with service provider, you can look into getting other configuration information and things like that. But again, just save that file, come back to the browser in Windows. And now it'll work just like it would work with any IOC container that you have. Of course, I changed it now to return a view, and you can see it's going out and looking for an index view. So, and that's exactly what we would expect, right?
Is the IOC container in the startup class, is that just Unity essentially, or?
No, it's something that they built custom. And they expect you to be able to plug in Unity or structure map or things like that. So let's do this. Let's create another web application that already has some features built in, and I can just walk you through some of the things that are in there that are interesting. So this time I'll create one with a starter template, which will produce a application a lot like if you went into Visual Studio 2013 and said, give me a new application with that manages users and lets them sign up and things like that. So new project, ASP.NET web application. Really want this to go into the temp folder. And I'll pick the starter pack, starter preview web. It uses individual user accounts. And so while that is getting created, let me see if I can come in and show you that underneath my user folder now, I have a .dnx folder. And essentially the way things used to work with technologies like NuGet is when you had NuGet packages in a project, it would get brought down into the file system in a packages folder, like at the solution level. Now packages just live in your user folder. So this is sort of the global location for all packages that are being used on this machine. And you can see that they are first put into a directory, and if I go into this directory, I could potentially have different version numbers inside of there. You'll also notice the different runtimes that I have installed. So Core CLR for 64-bit architecture, Core CLR for 32-bit, or sorry, that was full CLR, and then Core CLR. Yeah, so it's just something I wanted to show you there while this is spinning up. So let's look at this one. First, I'll try to run it, make sure it's going to run. And it should come up with one of those websites that is using Bootstrap and has the links for like about us and so forth. And it doesn't look that pretty, but it is data software. And then, of course, I could click the register link and register as a user and all that. I just wanted to show you some things that are in here that are different. So first of all, let's look at the project.json file for the project. A lot more assembly references there. There's also this concept of commands. So commands are basically shortcuts for things that you can do with your web application from the command line. So if I wanted to launch this web application in a web server from the command line, there's a shortcut command here called web that I can use to do that. And what this is web is an alias for loading, this assembly, Microsoft.ASP.NET.hosting, and looking for the main method in it and just invoking it and then passing along these parameters. It's basically saying, start this hosting assembly, pass along a parameter that says the server to use is web listener, which just uses Windows HTTP.sys, and this is the URL to listen to. There's one here for entity framework commands, so if you want to add migrations or run migrations, that's here. And the way I would use that, hopefully you can see the screen. If I come into Web Application 3, I think is what we just created. And come right into that folder where this project.json file loads. I can use this utility called DNS. Should be able to use the utility called DNS. First, I'm going to have to use this other utility, I think. You know what? Let me come back to that. Come back and explain that a little bit later, I think. I thought everything was already set up for me. But you're going to be able to put different commands in here to have your web application doing different things. And I think this is interesting, only because, again, of certain Azure features like web jobs, where you can basically run an executable or run some code in response to something happening in a message queue or a timer expiring. You'll actually be able to put that logic in your web application and have it run with a command from the command line. So I think that's interesting. here's an example of things that happen after you have restored NuGet packages. So that's what the post-restore step is. We can talk about what these tools are. If you haven't done any Node.js development, they might be a little bit new. This is the script to run as we're preparing to run the application. This is going to copy some files around. Let's go in and look at the startup file. So this part is interesting. There is no web.config anymore. And basically, you get to build your own configuration system, and you can build it however you want it. What this is saying is, first of all, I want a new configuration that is primarily based on a config.json file. So config.json can have my connection strings and things like that. In fact, that's all that's in here right now. It's just entity framework connection strings for the identity database. But you can continue adding configuration sources, and the last one that has a particular setting will win. In other words, I can have my development connection string in a config.json, and on my production server, I could put the connection string in a system environment variable. And when ASP.NET sees that environment variable, it will use that instead of what's inside of config.json. You can even do things like add JSON file, config.release.json, something like that. So if that file exists, it overrides whatever is in config.json. And there's also support for command line arguments that are passed to your application, and believe it or not, for any files, for whatever reason. So you get to build your own configuration. Here we can see Entity Framework is playing along with this whole idea of services and dependency injection now. So we're going to add the Entity Framework as a service, give it our configuration source. We're going to tell it to use SQL Server. So I don't know how much you've been following the Entity Framework, but it sounds like they're doing some interesting things where they're going to support in-memory data stores, they're going to support Redis, they're going to support table storage, so they're going beyond just relational data stores. But this application will use SQL Server, and it's going to use this particular data context, and it's going to use the identity services, and it's going to use ASP.NET MVC. And we're going to configure in some middleware here to use browser link. That's the technology that refreshes the browser when I save a file, to use a default error page, to use a different error page for certain types of database errors, to serve static files. One of the most important reasons to add that particular piece of middleware I found through personal running into problems myself is that if you're running with IIS Express or in IAS and you just have HTML files and CSS files in www.root, everything will work just fine, because essentially if .NET doesn't handle the request and it lets it go through to IIS, IIS will find these files on the file system and serve them. But if you're using something like, well, not IIS, and you're doing something like trying to run it as a self-hosted application or run it on Linux, you're using a web server that doesn't necessarily behave the same way. So use static files, will make sure it works everywhere. Use identity, use MVC, there's our default route. Let's look at the home controller. And again, it's no different from the controllers we've used in the past. The account controller is still ugly. Some new things that are in here, though, are let me just talk about Gulf and Bauer here for a second. So I can't see your hands right now. Well, now I can. How many people have done any programming with Node? No. Okay. So, well, here's the story. front-end development is getting a lot more complex, we know, and there's frameworks out there like Angular and Aurelia and Ember and all this stuff going down on the client, and JavaScript's getting more complicated, and these days we need to do things like compile JavaScript and learn it and check it for errors. And the people that have really been at the forefront of all of this have been the people that work in Node.js, because JavaScript is all they have. So they've built some of the best tools for JavaScript. What Visual Studio and the ASP.NET team has said is that, maybe we shouldn't go off trying to build our own things for JavaScript that do bundling and do minification. Maybe we should just adopt the tools that are already out there that are built in the Node ecosystem, because, quite frankly, they're pretty good and they're open source, and we can just build on top of that. So what they've begun to do is add some features into Visual Studio that allow you to run some Node tools to do things like compile JavaScript, minify JavaScript, bundle files together, and all of that. It's all built on top of Node, which is, if you're not familiar with Node, it is the simple way to think about it is imagine taking the JavaScript execution engine out of Chrome and just putting it into a console application so that you can run JavaScript from the command line. And if I type Node, I basically get a REPL where I can say things like person equals first name of Scott, and I can say console.log person.first name, right? So I'm just running JavaScript here. And if I do this, let's come into here. I can create a program with Node using like the same code, save it into a file, come on. And I can tell Node, let's run program.js. So if you write enough JavaScript and you pull down enough libraries, you can have Node do anything. So people have created Node programs to function as web servers. That's one of the more, that's the way I used to think of Node. Oh, people use it to write web applications, but it turns out you can write a lot of tools and command line utilities with Node too. So one of the more popular tools is a tool called NPM. So when you install Node on a machine, it will install NPM, and NPM is like NuGet for the Node world. You install packages with NPM. So Node itself doesn't come with very much, but you can NPM install stuff that does, cryptography. There's web server frameworks, RESTful frameworks. You can NPM install just about anything. And then, where this gets interesting for Visual Studio is, well, first of all, notice NPM install. So what NPM install will do is look at a file called package.json. Package.json is a file that NPM creates where it lists things that you have installed for this particular project that you're working on. And all Node really cares about is what folder are you in. So this JSON file for NPM is saying we have two files installed. One is called gulp, one is called rimraf. And by the way, if you're wondering why I'm going on and on about this, it's just I get a little bit excited about using Node in Visual Studio just because I do think the tools are pretty good. So first of all, what is gulp? So gulp is a package that you would install to essentially automate your building of front-end assets, so things like JavaScript, CSS files, images. If you go out and look at some of the gulp plugins that are out there, let's see if we can find a definitive list. You'll find plugins that there's thousands of them to do all sorts of things. So if you want to minify images, so it'll make images as small as possible. If you want to combine your CSS files into as few as possible, there's a plugin for that. So there's basically plugins to do just about anything that you would want for things that you deliver to a browser. That's what gulp is all about. So project.json is just saying, when you bring down the NuGet files, also make sure you bring down the NPM files, package files, which would include gulp. And then there's this other tool called rimraf, which is kind of a funny story. Rimraf is just someone's take on rm-rf in the Linux world, which is a way of saying remove all files. And what you can do is when that is installed, you can say things like rimraf and give it a directory name. And the reason they provide that is because Node is used to working on Linux-based file systems that have enough space to store large file names and large paths. On Windows, you quite often run into this problem with NPM, where after you have installed something, it's hard to delete it using Windows Explorer because the file name, along with all of the paths that it's inside of, is greater than 255 characters. So let me just show you. If I go into our web application 3, hopefully that font's big enough. But this is essentially the command that's going to execute npm install. And that's going to go out and say, oh, yeah, I have to bring down gulp and so forth. Whoops, that did not look like the proper output. Oh, yeah, I think that's fine. Everything came down. Everything is placed into a folder called Node Modules. So I can see gulp made it down. All right, where were we? Oh, yes. And then there's Bower installed. Bower is yet another package manager. It specializes in packages that you would use for browser-based development. So NPM is for Node, NuGet is for .NET. Bower, the way I think of it is Bower is for the browser. Basically, and I've actually been using Bower for about a year now with ASP.NET projects. If I want to, well, first, actually, let me just make sure. This is a brand new machine that I don't have completely set up yet. I'm going to have to npm install Bower before I can do this. npm install Bower in a global location, and I hope I have my command line Git client installed already. I think I do, because Bower requires Git, actually. Let me check real quick. Yeah. So that may take a second to download, but for a while I had used NuGet to manage my JavaScript frameworks and things like that, but it became apparent at some point about a year ago that NuGet packages were not always keeping up with the latest releases of things like Angular and Bootstrap and jQuery and stuff like that, whereas Bower, everybody keeps their stuff up to date for Bower, because in the rest of the world, Bower is just how you work with libraries like jQuery or jQuery validation or Angular. You Bower install all these things. So hopefully when this tool gets installed, I will just give you a quick demonstration of how easy it is to use Bower. This is just going to make sure we have our NPM packages and we have whatever we have installed using Bower, which would be what's listed in bower.json, which if I look here, I can see, so again, it's the same pattern. It's a JSON file that lists what I have installed. I have Bootstrap, jQuery, jQuery validation, Hammer.js, and some sort of carousel installed for this project. So those are all JavaScript files that would come down and be installed here.
Hey, Scott.
Yes.
I know in some of your recent blog posts you were using JSPM instead of Bower. Do you have,
yes.
I mean, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but do you have any comments as to one or the other?
I think if you're going to work with ECMAScript 6 or JavaScript 2015, as we call it now, use JSPM. It's a great tool for that. If all you're using is jQuery or Angular 1.x or Knockout, things like that, Bower's a good enough tool. And so you can see I Bower installed jQuery, and basically what that will do is create a Bower components folder with jQuery in it. That's actually the other thing I liked about Bower is with NuGet, you would NuGet install some library and it would just dump stuff into your scripts directory if it was a JavaScript framework, whereas Bower keeps everything in a separate folder, so it's a little more organized. If I'm making some sense about this, I hope I am.
Yeah.
More questions?
Where would you?
So real quick, I didn't want to. I didn't want to. Oh, go ahead.
So you were talking about JavaScript with Bower, but is it the same case with like less files or SAS?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. What JSPM can manage this too. There's not as much of a benefit though with those particular types of things like CSS and less and so forth.
So like if I wanted to have like if I wanted to pull down like the bootstrap, you know, the source. Where would I keep like a separate folder for all my less files outside of the www root?
Yes, I would. So actually, that's about what I was going to show you.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So what you would probably do is you would Bower install things into something like a Bower components folder, and you can have your less files there, things like that. And then when you build, you can have a process that compiles your less into CSS and dumps the CSS into www. And that is exactly what they're doing with Gulp. So now let me show you Gulp. Gulp is, think of it like, it's kind of like MS Build, but it's written with JavaScript. And the whole idea is that you're going to do things like, here's my clean task. What do I do when I clean something? I basically go out and remove all folders at this particular location. And this is a callback function to let the engine know when that's done. But this just means if I come into that folder, which is Web Application 3, source, Web Application 3. And I'm assuming everything's been installed correctly. These things here are like task names. So I can type, oh gosh, sorry. I will get things together. I can type Gulp clean. That's interesting. I was pretty sure I had Gulp installed. Hopefully this will just take a second. I should be able to type Gulp clean. It will execute this command, which is clean that directory. Or I could type Gulp copy. And what it will do is it will first execute clean, and then it's basically going to execute this code, which is copying things from one folder, piping them into a destination folder. That's what Gulp is doing there.
Is this just all project structure management then?
I think the question was, is this just all project maintenance?
Like project structure management.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I mean, I'm using Gulp a lot these days to do, actually let me swing over into a completely different project just to show you. Things like, here's a process that I do with my JavaScript now, which is I'm going to, this is basically saying, let's look at all the JavaScript in this directory with Gulp, pipe it through a compiler called 2.5, which basically takes ECMAScript 6 and compiles it into ECMAScript 5, and then create source maps for it so I can still debug it and then dump it into a destination folder. This is copying HTML files. Just, it's all project management and build type stuff.
Okay.
Typically no runtime. You don't do anything at runtime with Gulp. But I really think this is the direction they're headed, and that's why if you have a chance to learn some of these tools, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea, because I think in the future, a lot of us are going to be compiling JavaScript or compiling TypeScript or doing some sort of compilation phase, and it really looks like Microsoft is getting out of the business of building things like the web optimization tools, which we used to use to bundle JavaScript and concatenate files. You know, they're going to rely on tools like this now.
Do you have any recommended resources for learning?
Oh, yeah, I know that if you have Pluralsight subscriptions, I know John Papa has a course.
There was a resource, a recommended resource for learning some of the nodes.
Yeah, I don't know. There was a lot of noise there. I might have missed something.
Oh, I was just...
Yeah, in the previous build of Visual Studio that I had, there was actually a window I could get. I just don't know where it is, that would actually show the tasks in my Gulp file, and I could right-click something to run them, but I'm not sure how to get to, oh, here it is, task runner window. Here we go. So that, you know, they're even providing a little bit of Visual Studio integration for these tools. So I can see there's 2 tasks inside of there, and I can well, used to be able to right-click if I wanted to run one of them, but, oh, there we go. So there, that cleaned things out for me. You can also see some integration here, where it's basically showing you what I have installed with Bower and what I have installed with NPM. Not that I really think that's too valuable. I think it's just as easy to look in the JSON file. So let's see, what else? I think that was about everything I wanted to show you tonight. But you guys have any questions, observations, concerns?
Some of the node stuff is scary.
Yeah, it's definitely different. And like I say, there's certain things I worry about for some of the teams I know, and I know some people are going to be unhappy. Obviously, Microsoft is going to benefit from the node world by taking advantage of some of these tools and just integrating with them a little bit. And you know, now they don't have to build the same thing for Visual Studio, but at the same time, it is a much different world over there, and people who are used to not using command, well, it's not even the command line stuff. People who are used to things working all the time consistently, and you know, things being shipped and worked on and delivered all at once, and that's just not how that world works. You can, the node world, there's a whole bunch of little modules built by all sorts of different people, and things change pretty quickly over time, and I think that might frustrate people.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. We got Gulp installed. Sorry?
Did you say that you're going to show an example of using the DD context?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, we could look at that here with kind of what the this application is doing. So in startup, and I'll check the account controller real quick. I believe when you add identity to your service collection, that's sort of a helper method that's going to register things like user manager and application user and application DB context. So I guess this might be a little bit obfuscated, but ultimately that would allow you to do things like inject that into this account controller. So what about the OWN middleware itself that does identity? Should be able to see that here figure. And I think, I apologize, I'll have to dig into that a little bit to see actually what use identity is doing now. Well, I think what's happening is they must have reworked this. So this used to be the piece where you would see a whole bunch of middleware where you configure things like the login path and the user manager to use and things like that. We'll have to look at that source code. So I'm pretty sure it's probably just pulling things out of, or asking for things from the IOC container now, instead of you hard coding them in to the startup.
It's kind of like dropping you into the pit of success there, just making sure it's scoped and all that behind the scenes.
Right. Yeah, I would certainly expect it to be properly scoped, if nothing else. And I'm pretty sure it's going to get around the problem. I know exactly the problem you're talking about, where you have this reference to the DB context in middleware, and that's kind of like uncontrollable and works entirely different from the way you would use it from like a web API controller or an MVC controller where things get injected. Yeah. I think all of that goes away because they basically, this services collection is woven throughout the framework now. Right. And the middleware can use it, EF can use it, MVC can use it.
I like it. But it'll definitely take some getting used to.
A little bit, yeah. I actually plan to start building something in earnest with it in about 2 weeks. So.
When are you planning to deploy that then?
It probably won't be going anywhere serious until October, November.
Okay.
All right, we're rescheduling you in October, November.
I mean, have you heard anything about whether like Azure Web Apps is going to have support for this anytime soon, or anything we can do with that? I mean, I guess Bill's next week, so it could be announced soon. But.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything specific as yet, so I'm trusting that they'll do the right thing and have everything ready. So
yeah.
Question. Could you host the .NET Core app on an Apache server?
I would have to check. I think I've heard some talk about that, but I'm not exactly sure. I'm not really comfortable in that environment, but I mean, I would be really surprised if you couldn't, because just I know Apache's pretty flexible, and there's all sorts of modules or whatever they call them, so you can run Ruby and Apache, and pretty sure someone could get some sort of funk together to do that, but I don't know what Microsoft has officially planned for that. Right now, the way it stands, this thing runs on top of the Mono runtime if you run it under Linux, which personally, based on some of my observations and some of the things I've heard from other people, isn't really production ready if you have to handle a lot of volume. It's just not quite there. But Microsoft seems committed to working on that, so hopefully in the future that will be much better. And of course, since they're open sourcing the .NET framework, I would think the Mono team would be able to take advantage of a lot of things like, well, just get a lot of improvements to the Mono runtime.
Yeah, I think I saw they've made like over 1,000 changes in the past 2 months.
The community has?
Well, like to Mono source based upon either to Mono source or back to .NET Core.
Right. Feedback from the community?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like they're actively contributing.
Wow.
So.
Sounds good, yeah. Yeah, I know, like on Azure, Linux machines are about 30% cheaper than Windows machines, so it would actually be nice to run some of this stuff on Linux machines.
Well, does anyone have any questions for Scott? Well, Scott, thank you very much for telling us a bit more about what's to come.
Oh, sure. I tried to help. Hopefully you got something out of that.
Yeah, maybe we'll get you in person next time.
We'll fly you in.
Are you in Chicago?
We're about 2.5 hours south of Chicago.
Okay.
We'll check you out,
oh, there's Scott.
Okay. Sounds good. I was going to say, yeah, if anyone wants like a trial Pluralsight subscription, and you want to email me, I can send you some codes to try it out.
And we give out some Pluralsight as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's give a round of applause for that.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good evening.
You too.